Celeste Mercer laughed the moment the gavel came down at $99. Standing before her was a rotting wood frame house on Hollow Creek Lane. Sagging roof, shattered windows, weeds thick as a man's fist climbing past the porch railings, and a bright orange Enceinte structure sign hanging crooked at the gate. The man who had just bought it was Sawyer Langley, a single father in a faded flannel shirt, sawdust still caught in the creases of his hands. Celeste looked at him the way someone looks at a punchline they have already heard, with the flat amusement of a person who has never needed to rethink a first impression. "You just paid $99 for a pile of garbage," she said, and Sawyer picked up the old key and said nothing at all. 3 months later she came back, and the garbage was worth millions. Stay until the end to find out why that $99 house made a CEO come back to beg. The auction on that Tuesday morning was not the kind that drew crowds or television cameras, but a county tax lien sale. The kind where the government disposes of properties that have owed back taxes long enough that no one alive still cares about them. And the city of Nashville had listed 11 parcels on Hollow Creek Lane, a crumbling stretch of old neighborhood on the outer edge of the metro where the sidewalks had buckled and the streetlights had been dark for longer than anyone could remember. Most of the lots were straightforward, empty land, easily scraped, easier still to flip it into something profitable. And the attendees knew this and came prepared with paddles, lawyers, and spreadsheets full of acquisition targets ranked by demolition cost. Celeste Mercer had arrived with 2 men who carried themselves like people accustomed to winning rooms before they spoke. Vaughn Mercer, her uncle and senior partner at Mercer Development Group, a heavyset man in his late 50s whose practiced calm other people mistook for patience, but was actually the composure of someone who had already decided the outcome, and Garrett Holloway, their attorney and site planner, lean and efficient, with a leather portfolio he never set down. Together they had come to finalize the last few properties needed for the land assembly behind Mercer Hollow Creek Resort, a destination development that represented the largest single project in the company's history, a $140 million gamble on the idea that wealthy visitors wanted a curated experience outside Nashville's downtown core. The lot they cared least about was the one they ended up watching most closely. Parcel 11 at the end of the lane, a 2-story wood frame house abandoned for nearly 2 decades, unnecessary to their project footprint but flagged by Garrett as a potential nuisance, the kind of property best acquired cheaply before it ended up in the wrong hands. The auctioneer opened Parcel 11 at $200, and no one moved. He dropped to $150, and still nothing stirred. At $99, a hand went up near the back of the crowd and belonged to Sawyer Langley, 39 years old, in a flannel shirt washed so many times the pattern had faded to suggestion, carrying a manila folder that had been bent and re-straightened enough times to have permanent creases across the middle. He was a craftsman and a restorer by trade, the kind of man who took work that other people considered beneath them, stripping old floors and repairing timber frames and replacing porch posts on houses that developers had written off. And he was also a single father raising his daughter Piper alone. And the combination of those 2 facts had made him exactly the sort of person that someone like Celeste Mercer looked at and immediately categorized as background. She watched him sign the purchase agreement with faint amusement she didn't bother to conceal, and Vaughn said something to her low enough that only she could hear it, and she smiled, and when Sawyer stepped back from the clerk's table, she met his eyes without apology and told him he had just paid $99 for a pile of garbage. Sawyer didn't flinch. He looked at the house, at its broken windows, and the half-collapsed portion of the roof, and the wall of weeds between the fence and the porch, and then looked back at her with an expression neither angry nor embarrassed, but something quieter and more difficult to name, and said that some things are only cheap because the person doing the pricing doesn't know what they're looking at. Celeste assumed it was the kind of thing people say to themselves when they know they've made a mistake but can't afford to admit it, turned back to Vaughn and Garrett, and moved on to the next parcel without another thought for the man now standing at the rusted gate of a house no one else had wanted, turning an old key slowly in the lock. Sawyer brought his daughter Piper to see the house the following morning, before he began any real assessment of the damage, and she stood at the edge of the overgrown yard with her head tilted slightly. The way she looked at broken things, she was trying to decide whether to fix or leave alone, and asked why the house was so sad, and he told her it probably wasn't sad, just that nobody had listened to it long enough to find out. The structure was genuinely dangerous in several places. The staircase had 3 rotted treads. One section of the upper floor had given way over a weakened ceiling joist, and the roof was sound only across the rear 2/3, while the interior walls were covered in black mold, and the window frames had swollen shut against their casings. He set up safety barriers, hauled out the worst of the debris, and spent the first full week walking the structure with a flashlight and a notepad, tapping walls, testing joists, crouching under the crawl space to check the foundation, building the kind of picture that only comes from patience and from knowing what you're looking for. Beneath the decay, the bones of the house were extraordinary. The mortise and tenon joints at the primary load-bearing frame had been cut with a precision he associated with craftsmen trained before power tools made careful hand-fitting optional. The newel post at the base of the staircase was carved with a shallow original spiral no catalog had ever stocked, and the fireplace surround was made of hand-thrown brick in a size that hadn't been standard since before the Second World War. A neighbor pausing at the fence told him he was taking a considerable risk on a property nobody had held on to longer than a season, that there had been some kind of dispute attached to the deed years back, something involving the original owner that no one in the neighborhood had ever gotten a straight answer about, and Sawyer thanked him and kept working, because he was not a man who needed a straight answer to start. He needed a foothold, and the bones of the house were giving him one. He found the mark on a Friday afternoon, crouched at the base of the fireplace mantel with his flashlight angled low, small, cut cleanly into the wood below the mantel shelf, easy to miss unless you were looking for something that shouldn't be there. 2 initials intertwined inside the outline of a surveyor's compass, the letters W and T. He sat back on his heels with the flashlight steady and thought of his father Lawson, who had left him a spiral-bound pocket notebook filled with job notes and phone numbers and occasional observations about properties Lawson had worked on over the decades of his carpentry career. And near the back, in a handwriting grown cramped by arthritis, there were 2 pages about a man named Warren Tate, a self-trained architect and master builder who had worked Hollow Creek in the 40s and 50s, whose name had been methodically replaced on public records and building permits by the names of larger contractors who had taken credit for his work. Lawson had written that Tate didn't build houses, that he hid souls into the wood, that they took his name off everything, but he left something behind, and Sawyer had read those 2 pages so many times over the years that he could have recited them without the notebook in front of him. He photographed the mark, opened the notebook to that page, and set both side by side in the light of his phone to compare the initials before he touched anything else. Because he had learned from his father that the first instinct when you find something old and surprising is to reach for it, and the second instinct, the right one, is to hold still and look. Then he began pulling carefully at the crumbling plaster around the fireplace with his gloved hands, and behind the wall, sealed against the original framing with a fitted piece of old-growth pine, was a recessed cavity the size of a large shoebox. He carried it to the kitchen counter. The floor in that room was solid. with the hands of a man who had spent 20 years coaxing fragile things back from the edge of ruin, and unwrapped the oilcloth inside, and set eyes on something that changed the nature of everything he was holding. Inside the recessed cavity were 4 architectural drawings folded precisely to fit, printed on a heavy drafting paper that had yellowed at the edges but remained structurally intact, and they were detailed elevation and section drawings of the house itself, rendered with a quality that went far beyond what a standard contractor would have produced for a modest residential project. Every joint indicated, every load path traced, the framing system laid out in a way that explained the extraordinary precision Sawyer had felt in the bones of the building. In the lower right corner of each drawing, in a careful engineer's hand, was a signature, Warren Tate, and beside it a date, 1951. The structural system the drawings described was a hybrid timber-frame method, mortise and tenon primary structure with a pinned secondary grid, that had no direct equivalent in the regional building tradition of the period, either a reinvention or a rediscovery, and either way the kind of documented technical innovation that preservation architects and architectural historians would consider extraordinary. Sawyer called Brielle Dawson that evening, a local architectural historian and archivist who worked independently, contracting to universities and historical societies, and described what he had found without embellishment, sent her photographs of the drawings and the compass mark, and waited. She called back, in 40 minutes, her voice compressed in the way people sound when they are working to keep their phrasing measured because the alternative is to shout. She told him Warren Tate was documented in her research files as a real figure, a man who had designed or substantially contributed to at least a dozen structures in the Hollow Creek district between 1946 and 1962, before a series of real estate disputes resulted in his work being reassigned to other firms in the public record. And she told him no original Tate drawings had ever been located, and she told him that if his drawings were authentic, which the photographs strongly suggested, the property would be eligible for individual historic landmark designation under both state and federal preservation criteria. They found the letter the following afternoon inside a small wooden box, fitted under a loose floorboard in the dining room. Written in a hand matching the drawings, addressed to a son whose name was not given, dated the summer of 1964, Warren Tate had written in plain language that he understood his work would be taken from him in the formal record, and he had hidden the drawings in the house because he believed a building tells the truth about who built it to anyone patient enough to listen, and he was not willing to let the house be called an empty lot by people who had bought it cheaply on the strength of a lie. Sawyer stood in the gutted dining room for a long time, with the letter in his hands, thinking about his father's notebook and the 2 pages written in cramped handwriting about a man neither of them had met. And through the empty window frame he could see a black SUV parked on the street outside with its engine running. He thought about the man who had written the letter, who had hidden drawings and a testament and a record of names inside the walls of his own house, because he understood that a building can outlast the people who would erase it. And he thought about his father, who had worked in rooms like this one for 40 years and left no monument except a pocket notebook, and a son who had learned to look at old wood the way other men looked at faces, for the history written in what hadn't changed. He thought about Piper, 8 years old, and asking why the house was so sad, and about the fact that the right answer was not sadness but patience, that the house had simply been waiting for the right kind of attention. He looked again at the letter, at the precise handwriting of a man who had been careful with what he built and careful with what he left behind. And he understood something his father had understood before him. The people who call something worthless are almost always the people who most need it to be. He folded the letter back into the wooden box, set it beside the photographs of the drawings and the image of the compass mark, and began making a list in his own notebook of every step that would need to happen before the house could say what Warren Tate had intended it to say. Outside on the street, the SUV sat and ran and waited, and its presence told Sawyer that whatever the house contained was already considered a problem by someone who hadn't yet seen the inside of it. While Sawyer was working through the implications of what he had found, Celeste Mercer was in a glass-walled conference room on the 17th floor of a building downtown, listening to Garrett Holloway explain why the Hollow Creek project timeline was 3 weeks behind, and filtering his explanation for the 1 or 2 real obstacles hiding inside the noise. Mercer Development Group was not in trouble, exactly, but it was in the kind of precarious position that required a large and successful project to land before 2 institutional investors decided to reallocate capital elsewhere. And the Hollow Creek Resort had been the answer to that pressure, a destination-class development on land Garrett had identified as dramatically undervalued in a neighborhood that nobody with serious money was paying attention to yet. What Garrett did not tell her in that meeting was that the original historical assessment he had commissioned for the site had come back with a flag. A consulting firm had noted that several structures on Hollow Creek Lane showed construction characteristics consistent with the documented work of Warren Tate, a mid-century craftsman whose projects had been considered for cultural heritage designation in a previous planning cycle. Garrett had buried the flag in an appendix, commissioned a second, narrower assessment that found no actionable historical significance, and filed the second assessment as the operative document, and a junior associate on Celeste's team had mentioned Warren Tate once, citing a reference in some archived city planning minutes, and Garrett had dismissed it as local folklore, the kind of story neighborhoods tell about themselves to resist change. And Celeste had accepted this without pressing further, because in 11 years of working together, she had learned that asking Garrett about method tended to produce answers more complicated than the situation required. Vaughn suggested, with the casual efficiency of a man who had smoothed many such wrinkles, that if the Langley purchase created any complication, the company could make the man an offer. Something generous enough to look like a windfall to someone in his position. And Celeste nodded, and Garrett said he would have someone handle it. And she did not ask what handling it looked like, because outside her window the afternoon light was settling over Nashville in long horizontal bands, and she had a project to save, and the house on Hollow Creek Lane was background. The man who knocked on Sawyer's open front door the next morning was polite in the particular way that people are polite when they have already decided the person they are speaking to has no leverage, introduced himself as a representative of a real estate consulting firm with a card that listed no address, said the property was a significant financial and structural liability, and offered $5,000 for an immediate voluntary transfer of the deed. Sawyer told him no, and the representative came back 2 days later with $20,000. Then on the third visit, $50,000, and each increase told Sawyer more than any disclosure document could have. The price climbing in those increments meant that someone with considerably more information than they were admitting was working backward from a number they did not want him to know. Celeste was not present for any of these visits. Garrett had described the process to her as outreach, a standard conversation to determine whether the property owner was interested in a voluntary sale, and she had asked no follow-up questions. Sawyer began the restoration in earnest, working in the way his father had worked, methodically, without haste, labeling each salvaged board with a number corresponding to a position on a hand-drawn plan, photographing every stage as both documentation and insurance, replacing only what was beyond recovery and recreating what was missing from documentary evidence, rather than substituting modern materials for the sake of speed. Piper came on Saturdays in the canvas work apron he had cut down to fit her, sweeping the sections of floor he had declared safe, and she taped a hand-lettered sign to the interior of the front door that read Langley House Project in uneven capital letters, and he left it there. Brielle filed a preliminary inquiry with the State Historic Preservation Office, which was returned within 10 days for insufficient documentation, specifically the absence of a recorded plat map confirming continuous chain of title. And Garrett had anticipated exactly this procedural requirement and ensured the relevant mapping records were not easily accessible. Sawyer found the reference he needed in his father's notebook, a name, Delaney Brooks, a property rights and heritage attorney who had worked Hollow Creek disputes years earlier, and whom Lawson had described in 2 sentences as the one person who knows where the paper is buried. He left a message on her office line that evening, not knowing that Delaney's last formal engagement with anything connected to the Mercer family had ended in a disagreement significant enough that she had declined 2 subsequent referrals from their firm. What followed over the next 3 months was the kind of transformation that is difficult to describe in linear sequence because it happened in every part of the building simultaneously, the way a living thing recovers rather than the way a machine is repaired, and Sawyer worked days on paid restoration jobs across Nashville and spent every evening and full weekend on Hollow Creek Lane, replacing the collapsed roof section with hand-split cedar shingles from an eastern Tennessee mill that still cut to the original 19th century profile, repairing the staircase with old-growth white oak he had been keeping in his shop for years for a project that deserved it, rebuilding the porch post by post until the structure had its proportions back. The colored glass panels in the upper sash windows turned out to be original leaded glass in a soft amber and green that threw warm light across the front parlor floor in the late afternoon, in a way that made the restored plaster walls look like something from a painting, and the hand-thrown brick of the fireplace surround clean to a deep red-brown with variations of ochre and gray that no modern masonry product could replicate. And the structural system Tate had designed performed exactly as the drawings indicated it would, which meant the building required less intervention at the primary frame than any house of comparable age and neglect Sawyer had ever touched. Brielle worked in parallel, building the documentary case with the thoroughness of someone who knew it would need to withstand a legal challenge. She located 3 photographs in the Nashville Public Library archive showing Hollow Creek Lane in the mid-1950s, and the house at Parcel 11 appeared in 2 of them, unmistakably the same structure and unmistakably the centerpiece of the streetscape, and she found a brief unsigned notice in a regional building trade journal from 1952 describing a new residential construction technique demonstrated in a Nashville project, the language matching Tate's structural system precisely. Delaney Brooks reviewed the Mercer assessment documents Sawyer had obtained through the county's public records process and found the seam where the 2 reports had been incompletely reconciled. A footnote in the first assessment referencing a preliminary architectural character survey, a document neither attached to nor listed in the second assessment's bibliography, and she had seen this kind of omission before, and she knew it was not the kind of mistake that happened by accident in a professional document prepared for a $140 million project. Celeste drove past Hollow Creek Lane twice in the second month, and the second time she slowed and looked more carefully. The sagging roofline was gone, replaced by something clean and correct. The porch had regained its posts. The upper windows held glass that caught the light in a way she had not expected. She continued to her meeting and said nothing to anyone, but she did not dismiss what she had seen. By the end of the 3rd month, the Historic Preservation Office had scheduled an on-site review, And the day before the review, Sawyer walked every room of the house one more time, not looking for problems but for the story the rooms would tell to people who had trained eyes and neutral intentions. He had set the 4 original drawings in conservation glass frames along the parlor wall beside the fireplace, had arranged the documentation Brielle and Delaney had assembled on the parlor table, and had placed Warren Tate's letter, framed as well, near the entry so it was the first thing anyone would see when they came through the door. The morning of the review, he opened the front door of a house that had cost him $99 and stood aside to let 3 evaluators walk into a front parlor with restored plaster walls, a functioning carved oak staircase, amber and green light falling across reclaimed pine floors, and the 4 original architectural drawings mounted carefully along the wall. The lead evaluator moved through the room slowly, making notes without speaking, and returned twice to the basement before returning to the parlor and standing for a long moment in front of the drawings, in the particular way that people stand when they are deciding whether what they are seeing is as significant as it appears. She told Sawyer that if the chain of documentation held, the property wasn't just eligible for designation, it could establish the basis for a district-wide survey that would change the regulatory picture for everything within a certain radius. And she said this in the measured tone of a professional who understood the implications but was not responsible for them. She meant the resort project, though she did not say so by name. She did not need to, because Sawyer had understood from the moment he opened the oilcloth on the kitchen counter that the house was not just a house but an argument. And now someone with the authority to validate that argument had just told him the argument was sound. Celeste arrived on Hollow Creek Lane on a Thursday morning, intending to review the demolition sequencing for the southern parcels, had accepted Garrett's characterization of the Preservation Office notice as a preliminary inquiry with no binding effect, and was not prepared for what was on the street when she turned the corner. The house at the end of the lane had become something else entirely, its restored cedar roof catching the morning light cleanly, the porch wide and squared with turned posts and a carved rail, the upper windows throwing their amber and green patterns across the front facade, the yard cleared and planted with native grasses, and 2 young dogwoods just coming into their spring color. Standing in front of the gate, beneath a temporary banner reading Tate House, pending historic landmark review, were Brielle Dawson, Delaney Brooks, representatives from the Preservation Office, a local newspaper reporter, and roughly 20 people from the neighborhood who had decided to be present for whatever this was. Celeste stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house for a long moment without speaking, remembering the weeds and the orange sign and the certainty with which she had looked at Sawyer Langley at the auction and categorized what he had bought and what kind of man would buy it. And she understood now that the house had not simply been repaired but restored, not to what a designer imagined it might have been, but to what it actually had been, with the evidence visible in every detail. Impossible to dismiss if you had any sense of the difference between a building that had been dressed up and a building that had been listened to. Garrett spoke first, telling the Preservation Office representatives that the application was premature and that the company's counsel had procedural concerns. Vaughn stepped close to Celeste and said, low and controlled, that if the landmark review succeeded, the resort footprint would need to be redesigned at a cost of somewhere between $15 and $25 million. Celeste walked up the porch steps without responding to either of them, and Sawyer opened the front door, and she stepped inside. She moved through the parlor slowly, looking at the fireplace surround, the staircase, the drawings in their frames, trying to apply the training she had built over a career of assessing old buildings in terms of square footage and replacement cost and regulatory encumbrance, and finding that the training was not operating as reliably as it usually did. She stopped in front of the fireplace, and Sawyer pointed to the compass mark beneath the mantel shelf without a word, and said that 3 months ago she had asked him why he paid $99 for garbage, and the answer was that he hadn't believed the person doing the pricing. Celeste looked at the initials and had nothing to say, and Delaney appeared at the parlor door and handed her a document, a side-by-side comparison of the 2 Mercer assessment reports, with the suppressed flag highlighted in the first and its corresponding absence in the second circled in red ink. Delaney walked Celeste through the document with the patient clarity of a lawyer who had learned that directness is kinder than softening. The first assessment had identified 4 architectural characteristics on Parcel 11 consistent with documented Warren Tate construction methods, and had recommended a specialist survey before any demolition planning proceeded. The recommendation had been present in the draft, and it was absent in the version filed with the project application, and the version filed named Garrett Holloway as the reviewing signatory. Garrett said the findings had been evaluated and determined inconclusive, that the consulting firm had a history of over-flagging projects, and that commissioning a second assessment had been entirely standard. Then Brielle entered the parlor with her tablet and turned it to show an email she had located in a public records disclosure sent from Garrett to Vaughn 11 days after the first assessment was received, and the relevant line read, "If the Tate identification holds up in a specialist review, we're looking at a full district survey and 18 months of delay minimum. The entire southern corridor goes dark." The sentence meant they had known the nature of the risk from the beginning, had known and managed the knowledge instead of disclosing it, because disclosure would have required redesigning a project already presented to investors based on its original footprint. Vaughn told Celeste to be careful about conclusions she was drawing from a single out-of-context email, and that her role as chief executive was to make decisions based on complete information rather than a narrative being constructed by a man who had paid less than $100 for a parcel of land and had every financial incentive to inflate its significance. Sawyer, standing in the doorway, said quietly that the house had been worth exactly what it was worth before he bought it, and before he fixed a single board, and that the only thing that had changed was who was looking at it. He told Celeste about the families. Delaney had found 14 separate residential sales in the Hollow Creek district over the preceding 4 years, each preceded by delivery of the Mercer assessment finding no historical significance, each resulting in a sale price estimated at between 30% and 60% below fair market value given the unreported heritage context. And some of those families had sold because they needed the money and believed, on the basis of the document they had been given, that the market had simply decided their homes were not worth more. The document had been wrong, and someone had known it was wrong. Celeste stood in a parlor that had cost $99 and held a document that told her what her company had done, and thought about the investors who had funded the project on the numbers she had presented, and thought about the employees whose livelihoods depended on it. And when Sawyer said, not unkindly, that saving a company by burying the truth wasn't saving anything, it was building something expensive on top of someone else's floor, she did not answer, but she did not leave. What Vaughn and Garrett did next was a version of something they had done in other cities with other inconvenient facts, and they did it efficiently. Within 72 hours, 2 regional real estate news outlets had published items questioning the legitimacy of Sawyer's preservation claim, suggesting that a restoration contractor with no formal credentials had purchased a condemned property for a nominal sum and was using a manufactured heritage argument to extract a 7-figure payout from a legitimate development company, and the word used most often was opportunist. The coverage created friction in Sawyer's life that had nothing to do with the project. People he had worked with for years sent careful messages. Someone shouted something from a car window on a weekend, and Piper was asked at school by a classmate whether her father was trying to steal money from a company, and he spent an evening explaining to an 8-year-old the difference between standing up for something true and demanding something unfair, in terms that would not frighten her and would not teach her cynicism before she was old enough to need it as protection. Celeste saw the coverage and recognized it without having ordered it. Having seen Garrett's media work before in 2 other project cycles, and told herself each time that controlling narrative was a real professional skill, and she found now that she could not hold that reasoning as comfortably as she once had. Delaney had continued building the legal picture, and the 14 documented sales were the core of it. But there were also irregularities in the chain of title processing for 3 of the parcels acquired directly by Mercer, places where the historical survey flag should have triggered additional review under county ordinance and had not. And if the Tate House designation succeeded, those irregularities could support civil claims by the original sellers. Vaughn presented Celeste with a buyout figure for the Langley property, told her the number was generous, and told her, in the way people deliver warnings framed as observations, that everyone had a pressure point, particularly people with limited financial resources and a child in their care. Celeste looked at her uncle for a moment, said she would handle the next conversation with Sawyer herself, and arrived at Hollow Creek Lane that evening without Garrett, told Sawyer she was not there to make an offer, but to understand the house, and he considered her for a moment, and said that if she came to take it she would leave empty-handed, but if she came to listen she could stay. The basement had been the last major section of the house to be cleared, and Sawyer led Celeste down the restored staircase with a lantern into a floor of original brick laid in a herringbone pattern, dry and intact under decades of accumulated sediment, with fieldstone and mortar walls built in the manner of a working foundation, solid in the way things built to last are solid, without excess, without apology. On the south wall, in pencil lines protected from light and moisture by the fieldstone overhang, there was a full elevation drawing of Hollow Creek Lane as it had existed around 1955. Every building indicated in a distinct hand that suggested the drawing had been made by someone who cared about the individual character of each structure, with construction notations beside several buildings in a hand that matched the drawings upstairs. Warren Tate had used his own basement as a working archive. Brielle had determined, working with Delaney and a colleague from Vanderbilt's architectural history program, that the Hollow Creek House was not simply a notable individual structure but a prototype, the first built example of a planning approach. Tate had then applied to at least 7 of the surrounding buildings, which meant the designation of Tate House carried an implicit argument for a district-wide heritage survey, affecting every parcel in the immediate vicinity, and this was why the price had climbed from $5,000 to $50,000, why the media campaign had launched within 72 hours, why the chain of title irregularities existed. The project had been designed around the removal of this specific building's story, because the story, once told completely, changed what the land was worth in every legal and regulatory sense. In a fitted recess near the base of the south wall, Sawyer had found the last document, a handwritten list on 3 sheets of paper headed with the years 1949, 1953, and 1958, and beneath each year a column of names with occupations beside them: laborers, carpenters, tile setters, plasterers, ironworkers, people from across the socioeconomic range of mid-century Nashville, whose descendants would not have appeared in any professional building association's formal membership list. Warren Tate had kept the record because he believed the work of a neighborhood belonged to the people who had built it, and he had hidden the record in the same place he had hidden everything else he expected someone to try to erase. Celeste read the names by lamplight and recognized none of them individually but understood what they were. The undocumented labor of a community that had been offered, by Garrett Holloway's revised assessment, the conclusion that its own history had no market value. The sound of footsteps on the porch above was followed by Garrett's voice, and an uninvited structural engineer he had retained to argue the basement was unsafe for occupancy. And Delaney met them at the door and told the engineer, with a precision that came from having anticipated exactly this move, that the property owner had full legal authority over the contents of the structure, and that the arrival of an uninvited assessor at 9 in the evening did not constitute a structural safety review under any applicable statute. Garrett looked past Delaney to Celeste, who was still at the south wall with the list of names in her hand, waited for her to defer to him the way she had deferred to him on dozens of decisions over the preceding decade, and she turned to him and told him to leave the building. And then, after standing in Warren Tate's basement a few minutes longer, looking at the pencil elevation and the fieldstone foundation that had outlasted every expectation anyone had ever had for it, she told Sawyer she was suspending the Hollow Creek Resort project pending an independent review. The announcement reached Mercer Development Group's investor group before Celeste had finished drafting the formal communication, because Vaughn had called 3 board members directly, and by the time she sat down in the boardroom the following morning, the temperature in the room was the kind she associated with decisions that had already been made before the meeting was called. Vaughn opened by telling the board that the chief executive had allowed a personal and emotional response to an isolated preservation claim to override sound business judgment, that the resort project represented the largest investment commitment in the company's history, and that the decision to suspend it on the basis of a single property's contested designation was precisely the kind of unilateral action that the governance structure of a responsible organization was designed to prevent. Celeste put the documentation on the table and described what existed without framing it as a defense or an accusation. 2 assessment reports, one commissioned, received, and deliberately suppressed before the project was presented to the investment group. 14 residential sales in the Hollow Creek district completed on the basis of the suppressed valuation. The email between Garrett and Vaughn with its date and its contents. The documents arranged in order so any board member who wanted to follow the sequence could do so without her guidance. A board member asked the direct question, how much would redesigning the project cost? And Celeste gave the estimate. Between $12 and $18 million in additional design and carrying costs, offset partially by the reputational value of a heritage integrated project, which a growing segment of institutional investors in cultural destination real estate had been weighting positively. Another board member asked about the exposure if the company did not suspend, and the designation proceeded through litigation, and Delaney, invited to present as independent counsel, gave the floor figure. The civil exposure from the 14 documented sales alone began at roughly $40 million before punitive considerations. Sawyer delivered a brief statement from a single handwritten page. He said the house on Hollow Creek Lane had been called worthless by the people who had the most to gain from it being worthless, and that this was not, in his experience, an unusual situation, and when he finished, Vaughn told the room they were listening to a man who had made $59,999 on a $99 investment and framing it as a civic act, and Sawyer looked at him and said he hadn't sold anything. Celeste proposed the redesign. The Hollow Creek project would proceed as a heritage integrated development, adaptive reuse of existing structures where possible, new construction scaled to complement the historic fabric. Tate House designated and open to the public as an interpretive anchor, the project returning less in the first 3 years and carrying significantly less legal risk than any alternative. The board voted to authorize the independent review and defer further project action pending its findings. And it was not the full endorsement she needed, but it was enough to stop what had been happening. After the board meeting, Celeste found Sawyer in the hallway outside the conference room, sitting on a bench with his jacket folded over his knee, waiting in the patient way of someone who had learned that important things take longer than they should, and she told him she was prepared to offer him a price that would be difficult to refuse. A figure reflecting the independent appraisal value of the property and its designation, fair by any reasonable measure, and Sawyer thanked her for saying it clearly and told her no. She did not argue. She asked him what he wanted, in a way that made clear the question was not tactical, and he told her he wanted the designation completed and recorded in the public file so it could not be reversed in a future planning cycle. He wanted Warren Tate's name restored on the public record for every structure in the district that Brielle's survey confirmed his involvement in. He wanted the families who had sold on the basis of the suppressed assessment to receive an independent review of their transactions and, where the documentation supported it, a compensatory process managed by someone other than Mercer Development's legal team. Celeste said she could commit to the first 3 on behalf of the company, with conditions her legal team would draft in good faith. And the 4th, she said, was not hers to give. That one was already done. It was not a negotiation in any sense she had been trained to recognize, because Sawyer was not bargaining for advantage. He was describing a shape of outcome that had nothing to do with what the house would sell for, and everything to do with what it would mean when all of this was over. Piper appeared at the end of the hallway, brought by a neighbor who had watched her that morning, and asked her father whether they had to move, and Sawyer told her no. Not yet, possibly not ever, because the house needed someone to stay in it and care for it the way it had been cared for once and forgotten and now remembered again, and Celeste crouched to Piper's eye level and told the girl that her father had seen something that a great many educated and well-paid people had walked past without noticing. Piper considered this and asked if that meant they were all going to fix the house together, and Celeste said she hoped so, and meant it in a way she had not meant many things she had said in boardrooms over the preceding decade. 6 months after the auction where a gavel had come down at $99, and a woman in an expensive coat had laughed, Tate House received its official historic landmark designation from the Tennessee State Historic Preservation Office, accompanied by a district survey recommendation covering 9 additional properties on Hollow Creek Lane, 6 of which retained sufficient original architectural fabric to qualify for inclusion in a registered historic district. Mercer Development Group announced the revised Hollow Creek Plan. The resort concept replaced by a mixed-use heritage district, adaptive reuse of the qualifying structures, new infill construction designed to the scale and material palette of the existing fabric, a boutique inn incorporated into 2 of the larger historic buildings, workshop and retail space for local craftspeople, a community interpretive center in Tate House itself, operated as a partnership between the development company, the city, and the Hollow Creek Neighborhood Association. Vaughn Mercer resigned from the board under circumstances the formal announcement described as a mutual decision. Garrett Holloway's firm was engaged in a civil proceeding brought by 7 of the 14 families identified in Delaney's review, with the assistance of the independent arbitration process Mercer Development had agreed to fund. Celeste remained as chief executive, with a board that was, for the moment, more careful with her than it had been. Warren Tate's name was formally restored on the public record, for 11 structures across the Hollow Creek district, and the Nashville Public Library added his drawings to its permanent architectural archive, accompanied by the letter he had written to his son in 1964 about buildings telling the truth to anyone patient enough to listen. The independent appraisal of Tate House, completed as part of the designation process, set a value on the property that Sawyer did not share publicly, and when a newspaper reporter asked whether he felt vindicated by the reversal in the property's fortunes, he said he hadn't bought the house to be vindicated. He had bought it because his father told him it was worth finding, and his father had been right, and being right had always mattered more to Lawson Langley than being believed. Delaney's arbitration process moved forward steadily, and Brielle's district survey continued through the fall, uncovering documentation of 4 additional Warren Tate projects that had been built and then buried under contractor names that had collected the credit without doing the work, which was the kind of discovery that felt to everyone involved less like a legal victory than like a correction in a record that had been waiting a long time to be set straight. On a Sunday evening in October, Celeste walked back down Hollow Creek Lane before the construction phase began, and the street changed into something new, and the porch light at Tate House was burning, and through the amber and green windows she could see the warm interior light of a house that was lived in and tended to and known. And Piper was on the porch steps, hanging small wind chimes from the railing post in a row, testing their sound in the autumn quiet. Celeste stopped at the gate. Sawyer was at the far end of the porch, replacing a section of trim, doing what he did. She looked at the light in the windows and thought about what she had said at the auction, the ease of it, the absolute confidence with which she had looked at something she didn't understand and called it garbage. "I called it trash," she said, and Sawyer looked up and said, that was all right. The house had heard worse for 60 years. She asked whether he ever regretted not selling when the price was high enough to change his life, and he looked at Piper hanging her wind chimes in the October quiet and said that some things are only cheap because the person doing the pricing doesn't know what they're looking at, and what you do with the knowledge that they are wrong tells you more about yourself than any number on a page ever will. Celeste stood at the gate a moment longer, looking at the house that had once been an orange sign and a sagging roofline, and a gavel coming down at $99, now alive with light in the dark, its value visible to anyone patient enough to stand still and finally see it.
Excuse me. Let's do it, guys. Welcome in, everybody. How's everyone doing today? Welcome in. Welcome in. Welcome in. Just knock this pizza down right quick.